Hi guys, it is Samantha. Today I'm going to be telling you guys my top 14 books of 2014. It was really hard to pick 14 because any type of list making is very difficult for me and results in intense internal struggle. But I did it because I want to show you guys. Also, these are in no particular order except for the last two, which are probably my top 2 favorite books of this year. Other than that, the rest can be in any particular order because, as you know, intense internal anguish when it comes to ranking things. Let us get started. The first book I want to show you guys is actually a graphic novel. That is Doctor Who: The Forgotten. I absolutely love this graphic novel. It spanned the first 10 doctors and their companions, and it was just a really good read, and I like seeing all the doctors kind of in one graphic novel. It had a bunch of different artists because this is actually a serial from the Doctor Who magazine, so there's a bunch of really cool art in here which changes, and I just really enjoyed it, and I thought it was quite good, so that was definitely going to make it on my list. The next book I have to show you guys is the first Mistborn book by Brandon Sanderson. This was a very good fantasy book. I have yet to read the next two. I know it will happen. I am so behind. I have like the Brandon Sanderson train has departed the station and I'm still back in Nantucket. And I don't know why I chose Nantucket, but I felt like it. So yeah. I really enjoyed this book. Thought it had a really interesting and fresh twist on a magic system using metals in order to burn certain types of magic. I thought that was really interesting. I like the story. The twist at the end totally got me, and I cannot wait to continue on with the series. So I'm glad I was able to venture into the world of Brandon Sanderson this year, and so this makes it into my list. Up next is one of the first books that I read and reviewed for my BookTube channel, and that is The Children of Hurin by J.R.R. Tolkien. I love this book. It is actually an incredibly depressing story. I mean, you thought Sauron was bad? Morgoth was worse. But it was a very good book. It isn't quite as dense as The Silmarillion, which I still need to get and finish reading. I never finished reading it way back when. But I really enjoyed it despite its depressing nature. I thought it was very good and rich per the usual Tolkien way. The next book that I read and launched me into exploring what is now one of my favorite authors was Eliza Flocke-Lamora by Scott Lynch. I absolutely love this book and this series thus far. It is amazing. Scott Lynch's writing is astounding. It's humorous. The way he has so many different plot points together that you're like in the middle of the book, like, how are you going to get all this together? How are you going to resolve this by the end of the book? And then he just weaves it all together in such a beautiful and intricate way that is just fantastic. So I really enjoyed this book. It was a great start to the series. Next up was Prince of Thorns by Mark Lawrence. This was a very interesting fantasy series. It is not your typical series. Basically, you get it from the perspective of the villain because Jurg is a very evil young lad, but it's really interesting. You can't help but feel compassion and empathy for him at the same time, particularly as the story goes along and you begin to learn more about his character and why he is the way he is. Very interesting fantasy series, not your typical fantasy book, and I really enjoyed Mark Lawrence's writing, so I highly recommend it if you haven't checked it out. The next up is The Slow Regard of Silent Things by Patrick Rothfuss. This was his novella that came out in October. It centers around Ori, who is one of the more beloved characters from the Kingkiller Chronicles. This is not your typical story. There really is no plot. You just kind of follow Ori around and learn things from her perspective, but it is full of beautiful illustrations, and per Patrick Rothfuss' way, it is told beautifully. I really enjoyed the story, even though it is not your typical story, so don't be expecting a story with a plot and things like that. It's not quite like that, but it is beautiful nonetheless. Next up is Percy Jackson and the Last Olympian. I finally read Percy Jackson books this year, and this one out of the 5 was probably my favorite. I really like how he wrapped up the whole story. I love these characters. I fell in love with them just like everybody else. I wish I would have read these a long time ago when I was a lot younger, but that's okay. I still enjoyed them at the age of 26. This was just a really good book, and I cannot wait to get started with the Heroes of Olympus series. Next up is another graphic novel. It is Amulet, Volume 1. I finally got this book. I got it at my local Barnes & Noble because it was signed, so I couldn't pass it up. I really enjoyed this book and all of the artwork. I think it's a really cute story, and I just love this guy's art. Even when he did those new Harry Potter paperback box set covers that I have, I fell in love with it, so I knew I had to get it and read it, and I'm glad I did. It is a fast-paced, fun little adventure story, middle grade. I highly recommend it if you haven't checked it out. A lot of fantasy elements and even a little bit of science thrown in, I would say. I just really enjoyed it and recommend you check it out. Next is a reread for me, but I decided to include it because it has been years since I reread it, and I feel like I was able to read it with fresh eyes as I'm older. wiser, but probably not. So that book is Inda by Sherwood Smith. I reread this back in November with Sabrina from Steakachino, and I just remembered how much I love this book. I still love it even after all these years since I've last reread the series. It is amazing. It is a perfect fantasy book. I would call it low fantasy. There's not too much magic, though there is some magic. A lot of political intrigue, a lot of really cool characters and characterization. The women in this book I really, really love. I love there's ships and pirates. Guys, there's everything you could want in a book series is in this book, and I highly recommend you check it out. She has created such a beautiful and rich world, and I love it just as much as I do when I first read it. Next is probably what I could now consider one of my favorite classic books. Yes, something has passed Jane Eyre. I never thought that would be possible. That is Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. I adore this book. It was so good, so good. The ending was beautiful and perfect. His revised ending, because he actually had a more depressing ending originally, but that's not included in this volume. I absolutely loved it. Charles Dickens is a brilliant author. I loved the character of Pip and just everything that happens. It was so good. Basically, the story follows an orphan Pip who's being raised by his sister and his brother-in-law. And he sort of comes into some great expectations, some money, and you sort of see the journey that it takes him on and how it changes him as a person and how he deals with that and what happens to him in the end. It is a wonderful story, beautifully told per Dickens' usual rich way. I highly recommend if you haven't checked it out. Coming down now towards the bottom, the last 4 books. The first of those 4 is Neil Gaiman's The Ocean at the End of the Lane. This is his short novella story thing. I'm not sure if you consider this a short story, a novella, or just a book, a novel. I don't know. But it was really, really good. I love Neil Gaiman's writing. He has a way of just creating such vivid imagery and creating intense feeling in you while you're reading the story that I absolutely love. The story is creepy and whimsical at the same time, and it is beautifully told. You can't say too much about this book without spoiling it because it is so short. It's a really, really great read. Number 3 is one of the few young adult books I read this year, and I actually really enjoyed it. That book is A Girl of Fire and Thorns by Ray Carson. I have not read the other 2 in the series, this trilogy yet, but I really, really enjoyed this one. It is a young adult fantasy book. It follows a girl who has a gallstone in her belly and has been prophesized to do great and grand things, but she herself does not feel this is possible. She's a little bit down on herself, sees herself as overweight and stupid and etc. And she's married off to a king, doesn't feel like she'll ever be able to become a queen, but events conspire to change all of that, and she soon grows to see herself as a beautiful young woman that she is, and other events transpire that are quite shocking and interesting. I just really, really enjoyed the story. These last 2 books are both 2 of my absolute favorite books of this year. I would consider them both to be my number 1 spot for this year of my favorite books. I love them so much. The first one is The Republic of Thieves by Scott Lynch. This is book 3 in the Gentleman Bastards series. I absolutely adored it. So much happens in this book. There is a big plot twist at the end that I did not see coming whatsoever. What I had thought was going to happen did not come to happen at all. It was full of a lot of wit, and there's a little bit of romance in there, and I just really, really, really enjoyed it. His writing is just so fantastic, and I just loved everything about the story from start to finish. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. The last book, and one of the last ones I read this year that quickly became one of my favorites, was Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. I adored this book. I first came upon this series when I was back in middle school, but I just, for some reason, never picked it up, even though I kept running into it off and on. Finally picked it up this month. I read it with a bunch of other awesome booktubers, and it was fantastic. I absolutely adored this book. It was everything I wanted and had been missing in a fantasy book. I don't know if you guys know what I'm saying when I say this, but there is something about the fantasy stories written in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s that seems to me a bit different from modern fantasy. Not that I don't like the modern fantasy books, I love them, but there's just something different about the writing style and the story that I really, really enjoy, and I think it's a sense of nostalgia for me, and that was in this book. It was written in the mid-90s, so it had everything I want and have missed in a book. I loved the story. I loved the characters. It follows the orphaned bastard son of a prince, Fitz. Yeah, and everything that conspires as he is sent to live in the palace and is being raised by his father's man. It is such a really, really great fantasy series. I highly recommend you guys check it out if you have not done so already. Oh, I cannot say enough good things about this book. I mean, there were parts that moved a little bit slow, but other than that, I loved everything. The characterization, the development, the plot story, everything about it. I loved it so much. It's probably one of my favorite books of this year. Definitely on my top 10 list now. That is right. I just said it. I called it. Both this book series so far, and this series so far have made it onto my top 10 list of books. That's hard to do. Alright guys, those are my top 14 books of 2014. Let me know down in the comments what some of your books were for this year and if you've read these and what your thoughts were. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and until next time, happy reading and happy new year. Bye!